reporting. While the cost of the war in Afghanistan has weighed heavily on the US economy, Europe's economic woes are largely of its own making. And now there are signs that Italy, the third largest economy in the Eurozone, is becoming increasingly vulnerable. It's a special problem for Germany, the most prosperous nation in Europe, which has been bearing the lion's share of the burden of propping up its failing neighbours. Andrew Leigh is an economist and a Labor MP in the Gillard government. Andrew Leigh, welcome to the program.
Good to be here.
You've just returned from Germany. How much longer do you think the German taxpayer is going to be prepared to keep bailing out the indolent neighbours of Germany like Greece, Portugal, Ireland and possibly Italy too now? How much patience have they got?
Well, Jim, Germany's really got a couple of challenges. I mean, one is the issue of debt bailouts that you mentioned, but the other is the challenge of ensuring that there is growth in the euro area. And at the moment, my read looking from this side of the world is that the Germans are focusing a little too much on fiscal austerity and not enough on growth-enhancing policies. You've really got to get growth somewhere in Europe if you're to see the southern neighbours out of recession.
Well, it does show you just how desperate things are when the IMF, of all people, are calling for fiscal stimulus.
Indeed, and so I think the issues in Germany are not that dissimilar from the issues in the United States. It's fiscal austerity is right for some countries. It's right for Australia with the interest rates 4 3/4%. It's obviously right in some of these countries with huge debt burdens, more than their annual income. But I don't think it's right for a country like the US, which has 9% unemployment rate, and it's not obvious to me that it's right for some of those powerhouses of Europe like France and Germany, which really need to be maintaining growth if all of Europe is to hang together.
But have they got the sources of money available to go further into debt themselves without getting into the same problem in Germany that some of the outlying states of Europe have already found themselves in?
Jim, I don't think that France or Germany are in any of the sort of strife that, say, Portugal, Italy, Greece find themselves in at the moment. And it really is important to recognise that in Europe now the average unemployment rate is 10%, and until you start bringing that down, until you get the economic growth churning through, then that's the engine that will ultimately drive Europe out of the slump that it finds itself in at the moment.
On a broader question, can the Euro survive without greater harmonisation of fiscal policy in Europe, and how hard is that going to be? It's hard enough in Australia with a two-speed economy to run a single fiscal policy. How do you manage it when you've got countries with economies as different as Greece, Estonia and Germany?
It's a good point, Jim, and in some sense Australia is facing some of those same challenges that the Eurozone is facing. You've only got one interest rate for a single currency, and that interest rate is always going to be a bit too high for some places and a bit too low for other places. And so, the real challenge for Europe is to make sure that you've got fiscal stimulus where you need it to drive growth. Much the same for Australia, where I think we need to make sure that fiscal policy is driving into the regions where growth rates are a little lower. That's why the Gillard government's, for example, committed to infrastructure investment, a series of road investment programs, both to complement growth, but also in the areas which are not seeing as rapid growth at the moment.
Talking about Australia and economic reform, respected businessman Don Argus is accusing your government, the government of which you're a member, of laziness when it comes to economic reform. And he is right, is he not, in pointing out, and he's not the only one, that productivity has barely moved in this nation for a decade. Why would not greater labour market flexibility produce results?
Well, Jim, it's right that productivity turned around the year 2000. Productivity growth has been declining since then. What's not right is that a return to the Howard government's more extreme industrial relations.
But that's not necessarily what Don Argus and others are suggesting. Even people like Heather Ridout, who represents manufacturers and has been something of a supporter of your government, has taken an aim at your industrial laws and suggesting that the flexibility within them is something of a sham.
Well, Jim, the best thing to do is to go back to the track record. So from 2006 to 2009, we had worse productivity growth than any other three-year period in recent Australian history. That suggests to me that if you're looking for solutions to the productivity problem, you're not going to find them in industrial relations changes. They're much more likely to be found in greater investment in skills, greater investment in infrastructure. These are things that we know have in the past lagged in Australia, and that's why we're really committed as a government to focusing on better skills and more infrastructure to drive productivity.
But are you seriously suggesting that for an industry like retail, a sector like retail, which is one of the big employers in the country, which is suffering severe stress, that greater flexibility in terms of their employees would not have an impact on margins and hence on profitability?
Jim, that's certainly not what the track record suggests. I mean, if we go to the Reserve Bank's conference recently held, they had a number of academic experts giving papers talking about productivity. Saul Eslake's paper said that he thought work choices did nothing for productivity, and for good measure, Jeff Borland's paper said that he thought work choices did nothing to lower unemployment. So there's some very careful economic evidence on this suggesting that a return to extreme industrial relations laws is not a solution to Australia's productivity problem.
You're also being seriously lobbied to do something for Australian manufacturing, which is under great pressure as a consequence of the appreciating Australian currency. The fact is, though, that this is part of a long-term trend, and really you can only tinker at the edges, can't you?
Well, Jim, it's certainly true that Australian manufacturing as a share of output peaked around the 1950s. That's also a pattern you see in other developed countries. We've got two big things going on at the moment. The first is that about 2 billion people are being reintegrated into the global economy in the form of China and India rejoining world trade, and that places big competition pressures on Australian manufacturing. And then alongside that, you've got the high dollar. Quadrupling of commodity prices has made it pretty tough for export-oriented manufacturing. Our manufacturers are doing some very good innovation work, but it's true that they need support, and the steel plan we've announced is a key part of making sure Australia has a strong manufacturing future.
Your government is at rock bottom as far as public opinion is concerned. Can you win from here? You'd have to come close to doubling your primary vote, which would be a world speed record in 2 years.
Well, Jim, I worked on a range of different topics when I was an economics professor at ANU. One of them was looking at the predictive power of polls. Turns out 2 years out from an election, an opinion poll has all the predictive power of a toss of a coin. In other words, if you're a serious reforming government, you focus on your agenda. You focus on doing things like putting a price on carbon pollution, getting a fair system of mining taxation, building a national broadband network. You don't focus on the day-to-day opinion polls, which frankly seem to be turning up pretty much every day of the week. That's certainly not why I got into politics.
Now, you're not a marginal seat member, but do you think that those of your colleagues who are may run out of patience with Julia Gillard at some point and worry about whether, with her still at the helm, they'd lose their seats?
I think the Prime Minister's doing a terrific job, Jim, and I think that is a view shared by the marginal seat members that I speak with regularly. But these are challenging times. We have an opposition which is relentlessly negative, and we have a minority government. These are doing big reforms is tough at the best of times, and those two factors make it even harder. But what would you want us to do? Would you really want us to make our policies every day based based on looking at the opinion polls we saw in the morning newspaper, I'd quit politics tomorrow if that was the that was the game. That's not the style of politics that I got in for, and it's not the style that Julia Gillard is committed to.
Now, talking of Tony Abbott, and you said negativity, well, today on the question of asylum seekers, which has been a big problem for your government, there was the first inkling, the first signs of bipartisanship from him on the Malaysia refugee swap. Would you support amending the Migration Act to make the Malaysia solution, as it's called, legal, if the opposition were to support that?
Well, we'll certainly need to have these conversations and work it through. I mean, it's important that Mr. Abbott recognises what is in the recent High Court judgment. He has a bit of a habit of ignoring economists, ignoring scientists, and sometimes, I fear, ignoring lawyers. If he gets that right and is willing to accept the High Court judgment, then we're certainly willing to talk with him. But these will be decisions that will be announced over the coming days and weeks.
Andrew Leigh, our time's up. Thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you, Jim.